Hello, and welcome to episode 438 of the Unauthorized History of the Pacific War podcast. My name is Seth Paradin, historian and deputy director of the Mississippi Armed Forces Museum. And with me, as always, is my esteemed co-host, retired Navy Captain Bill Tody, former skipper of the fast attack submarine USS Indianapolis, Commodore Submarine Squadron 3 in Pearl Harbor, and many others. How are you this fine? I don't know what today is, Bill.
Doing
Wednesday?
great, Seth. You know, a couple of weeks ago, you recorded an episode without me because
I did.
I was having bandwidth problems.
We did.
And I got a couple of emails that were very heartwarming, where people
Yes.
were worried that my bandwidth problems, quote unquote, were actually health problems. They were not. They were actual bandwidth problems.
Bandwidth
So,
problems.
Luke in Belgium, Leonardo in Italy, thank you for the notes. And I'm just fine. Thank you.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I can assure you that they were most certainly bandwidth problems. I haven't
They were.
seen Captain Tody that frustrated ever.
Ever.
So
Yeah.
obviously the third member of our crew is with us today. Fantastic friend and historian Jon Parshall. How are you today, John?
Well, it's been an exciting few
Been a
days for
week.
me, but yeah, oh my goodness. I just wanted to say too that this is the first time that the three of us have been recording together since we all got back from San Diego
Yeah.
from the Western Naval History Association. And I just wanted to give a shout out to all the people that came to the Midway to see us during that symposium. It was
Hmm.
great to meet you, and we had dinner with a number of you on
Twice.
both of the nights twice. One of our fans was so kind as to pay for our drinks the second night. That was incredibly kind and generous of you. It was a really fun time for me, and I hope that everybody that came out had as good a time as I had. It was just really great to have a chance to hang out with y'all.
It
Agreed.
was.
It was a great time. Bill and I have done several things here and there together. And as you said, it was the first time the three of us have been together, and to meet so many people that
Yeah.
enjoy what we do is very, very gratifying and humbling too. Very
Yeah,
humbling.
agreed. Very much
Mhm.
so. And it was also super cool to be able to
And
see
it
the
was fun.
Midway for the first time. Yeah, super fun. Yeah, it's
Oh, yeah.
a great time.
And
Anyway,
John, you're going to be in Fredericksburg at the Nimitz Museum, right? What's that deal? Will that have happened
um,
before this airs?
no, it's gonna,
No?
yeah, yes, it will
Yes,
have already
yes, yeah.
happened by the time this gets up.
Okay.
Yes, I'll be in Fredericksburg. They're doing a commemoration for the Battle of Iwo Jima, and
Yeah.
Rich Frank will be giving a talk there, and a couple other fellas as well. And I'm the cleanup guy. I get to do the mopping up, as it were. So
Mm,
yeah, good times. Anyway,
yeah.
Fourth in the batting order. Fourth in the batting.
yep, yeah, talk about the impact of the battle and what its sort of larger meaning was. And I'm also taking a dive into the home front, just going through a whole bunch of New York Times front pages to kind of paint the picture. And it gets back to some of the things that Seth, you talked about during the Kure raids. It just
Mhm.
people are sick of this war. I
Oh yeah.
mean, everyone is kvetching about the fact that I can't, there's price controls on butter and sugar and cigarettes, and everyone's mad. There's practically riots in New York City over lack of fruit, and Mayor LaGuardia has to open up extra fruit stands, and everyone's pissed off at the OPA. And yeah, anyway, it's really interesting. So that's what I'm doing.
Next season, even though this is a Pacific War podcast,
Yeah,
next season I want to do an episode or two on the American home front because
yeah,
Hmm.
that's something that has got this cloud of malarkey surrounding it. Everybody was in it together. No,
right.
dude,
Arm
they
in
were
arm.
not.
Yeah,
Yeah,
yeah.
no, they weren't.
There
And
was
Not
I'd
a
like
so
lot
to
of
shatter
much.
competition.
that myth. So,
Yeah.
Yes. I'm delighted to delve do that with if you want. So I'm
mhm.
interested in that too. Anyway,
Oh yeah. But that's
oh
not
yeah,
what we're here to talk about today.
that's not what we're talking about today.
No, indeed. All right. So normally I have a very pithy intro to our episodes here, and today is not one of those episodes. Just to give you guys a breakdown of what we're going to talk about here today is basically as we were going through kicking around ideas how to do this, we called it the the moral compass episode,
Right.
which may or may not be the right title for it. But John has a fantastic presentation that he sent over to us before we recorded this a couple of weeks ago. And we decided that we'd like to cover that here. So, John, I'm going to kind of hand this off
Yeah.
to you. And we're going to go back and forth, obviously, like we
Yep.
always
Mhm.
do, but I'm
Right.
going to hand this one off to you.
Yeah. So what I want to show here is one of the standard talks. I do this on the tour that I lead to Japan. And so this is the talk that I give to my guests in the evening after we visited the Hiroshima Peace Memorial and Peace Museum. It just kind of talks about, yeah, what were the real options for peace in July and August of 1945. And so without further ado, see if I can share my screen here. There we are.
Yep.
Because yeah, one of the problems that has always been the case around the morality of the dropping of the bomb is that it typically gets framed in terms of American lives saved versus Japanese lives lost. And I would actually like to expand that framework as we're evaluating what were the real options here. So, without further ado, I like to start off with this slide from Monty Python and the Holy Grail. And not just because it's hilarious and ridiculous, but also because there's a lesson here to be learned. So, for those who haven't seen the movie recently, King Arthur is riding through the forest. He comes to a bridge. It is guarded by the Black Knight. And the Black Knight tells Arthur, none shall pass. And this results in hand-to-hand combat. And in the course of that combat, one by one, Arthur cuts off both his arms and his legs. And we see the knight here, his stump sitting on the ground, famously telling Arthur, "'Tis but a flesh wound," right? And, we'll call it a draw. The point that is interesting here is when you think about this, what mechanism does Arthur have to compel the Black Knight to surrender? He can kill him, obviously. He's got that power. But how can he make him surrender? Does he have any mechanism to do that? And I think the more you contemplate that question, the more you come to the realization that there isn't any mechanism, that Arthur has no control over whether or not the Black Knight is going to surrender or not. That at the end of the day, it's got to be the Black Knight who makes the decision that I am beaten and I'm going to end this contest. And this scenario plays directly into what we see happening at the end of the Pacific War between the two primary opponents, the United States and Japan, that they are just in completely different mental spaces. And until the Japanese can come into our mental space, this thing is still on. So what I want to look today is at the context around the dropping of the bomb. I want to talk a little bit about the plans for Olympic, look at some of the Japanese war plans as well. And then, as I say, I want to reframe the moral calculus around the dropping of this weapon and widen it away from just a Japan-centric focus towards a more Pan-Asian focus, I guess I would say. And then, even though I'm widely known for my dislike of counterfactuals, I'm going to dive into what were some of the other potential scenarios, blockade, an invasion versus the bomb in terms of potential loss of life and that sort of thing. All right. So, where are we in the spring of 1945? And the answer is nowhere good. Anybody who can identify this city gets bonus points. No, it is not Warsaw. No, it is not Berlin. It's actually Manila at the end of the Battle of Manila in January, February 1945, the largest urban combat during the Asia-Pacific War that leaves about 100,000 civilians, Filipino civilians dead in the course of that. And of course, March 1945, we have the Tokyo firebombing, another 100,000 civilians dead, 1 million homeless, and about 16 square miles of Tokyo burned out, I believe, something like that. And then it brings us to the Battle of Okinawa, which kicks off in April 1. So the bottom line is that the longer this war is going on, even though we understand what the general trajectory for that war is, it's getting bloodier and bloodier and bloodier all the time, and everybody's casualties are mounting the longer this thing goes on. So just to sort of recap American plans here, the Americans, if they're going to do an invasion of Japan, realize they have to do it in two parts because they want to extend air-based or land-based air control over Japan, and their fighters can't get all the way up to Tokyo from Okinawa. So we're going to have to do it in two chunks. Go grab someplace in Japan to set up air bases and then make the second leap up to Tokyo. So the first operation is going to go into Kyushu. That's Operation Olympic. And that's scheduled for November of 45. And then 4 months after that, we're going to go up to Tokyo on Operation Coronet and hopefully end the war. So the plan for Operation Olympic is that we're assuming the Japanese are going to have about 350,000 personnel on Kyushu and around 2,500 aircraft. We're going to come in with, roughly speaking, about 250,000 personnel organized in 4 corps. 3 of those corps are going to go ashore initially and capture points around Miyazaki and Sendai and kick the Japanese to the curb. We're only going to capture about the southern half of Kyushu, but then you can see that it's relatively flat down in these neck of the woods, at least around Miyazaki and Sendai. We're going to set up air bases there or revamp the ones that we capture, like Chiron, and turn this into a gigantic airfield. Meanwhile, in Japan, with the fall of Iwo Jima, the Japanese government also falls within a couple of weeks, and the Koichi government goes out, and the Suzuki government comes in under Prime Minister Suzuki. He's got his foreign minister, a guy named Togo. We've got the respective Army and Navy ministers, Anami and Yonai, and then their 2 chiefs of staff, Umezu and Toyota. These guys collectively are referred to as the Big Six. They are the head of the main committee for the running of the war. And these are honestly the only 6 guys in Japan who have any sort of say-so other than these last 2 gentlemen, which are, of course, Hirohito and Lord Privy Seal Kido. Kido is a very good friend of Hirohito. He can be relied upon to be sort of channeling the emperor's will through him. So Kido becomes a very key player in, who's getting access to the emperor to influence him through this period of time. If you had to lay these dudes out on a spectrum of, never surrender kind of hardliners down to we should be surrendering right the heck now, it kind of looks like this. On the far end of the spectrum, you've got these 3 military men, Army Minister Anami, and then Umezu and Toyota. Anami is arguably, at this point, the most important man in Japan because the Navy is trashed and the Army has more physical boots on the ground at this point. So in terms of raw political capital, you can make an argument that Anami at this point is kind of the big kahuna. And he is an absolute hardcore dead ender who believes that every man, woman, and child in Japan should die before Japan should surrender. Then a little further down the spectrum, you've got Suzuki, although he's gonna start waffling as this process goes along, but he starts out pretty hardcore. And Hirohito, likewise, along with Kido, are basically of the opinion that, okay, we need to keep fighting at least as long as it takes to get one more big victory that gives us more leverage at the negotiating table, and then we will make the Americans give us some sort of a compromise peace, which will not require an American occupation of Japan or war crimes trials or that kind of stuff. So that's what they're playing for. Try to defeat the Americans one last time, and then we'll go to try to end this war, which I'll just say as an aside, I think is madness. I think that if the Japanese had managed to win one more victory, that just would have stoked guys like Anami to say, well, now we got to fight to the end. We're on a roll at this point. So it's just, yeah.
I completely agree, and I'm not to butt into your
No,
presentation,
please.
but I agree 100%. As again, we've mentioned this 100 times, is that these guys are chasing this mythical dragon
Yeah,
since June of 1942.
yeah,
The decisive battle, the decisive battle, and
exactly.
it has never gone their way in any way,
No,
shape, or form. And the fact that you've got Anami and others that are consistently, fermenting this idea in their minds shows you that they're completely out of touch with reality.
yeah,
Completely
exactly.
out of touch with reality.
Yep.
Mhm.
And so the last two guys, you got Navy Minister Yonai, who is seen as a peacekeeper, who's kind of on the fence at this point. And finally, you got Togo, who is like, no, we need to be negotiating now. But you can see that, the prospects for a peaceful resolution to this conflict in the middle of 1945 are pretty damn slim at this point because the cabinet is so heavily stacked towards hardliners. Japan's military situation, we've just finished up umpty episodes on where they're at this point. It's a disaster. It's a dumpster fire. They are now completely cut off from all of their raw materials down south. There's no more oil getting in, no more tin, no more manganese, any of that stuff. The longer this thing goes on, they're going to start running out of coal when Halsey trashes their ferries. Because of our submarines and our aerial mining campaign, too, a lot of the harbors that are on the Sea of Japan that are facing Korea are also being cut off. And so it's becoming increasingly difficult for them even to move stuff from China and Korea back over to Japan. The Imperial Navy has been effectively destroyed. The bulk of the Imperial Army is still in China and Southeast Asia, which means that because of that cutting off effect, if the Japanese are going to defend their home islands, they're going to have to do it with brand new legions that are raised in Japan and are going to have to be equipped in Japan too, in order to form that defense force. They got a lot of aircraft, but they got no fuel. And so the bulk of those planes are reserved now for kamikaze operations. So pictorially, this is kind of what things look like. You can see that we've got all these garrisons in the Central Pacific that have been cut off and left, to wither on the vine, like Truk. Rabaul, of course, there's 100,000 guys trapped down there. But at the same time, even though the sea lanes have been closed to Southeast Asia, Japan still controls immense swaths of Asia at this point. They probably have 450, 500 million people that are still under their control. And there's a lot of violence going on in those occupied areas, as we'll get to here in a little bit. Domestically, same thing, dumpster fire, literal dumpster fire in this case, because we've had firebombing ongoing since March of 1945. By the time we get to June, Curtis LeMay has burned out all the major urban areas and is now shifting to secondary and tertiary targets. And Japan's industry is now collapsing. It's going into a downward spiral because they haven't got any raw materials coming in. We are destroying all of the physical plant and equipment. And of course, a lot of the workers are spending increasing amounts of their time just trying to scrounge food, and there's just skyrocketing absenteeism as a result of all of this as well. Food situation, likewise, is really, really bad. Submarines have now cut off the islands, so there's not a lot of food imports coming in from Korea and China. The intra-island transportation system, Japan is weird because they actually, at the beginning of the war, relied more on small coastal freighters and luggers and that kind of thing to move stuff around inside Japan than they did on the railroads. And a lot of that stuff has been destroyed by this point in time, too. Submarines have taken them out. Halsey's carrier raids have taken them out. So that whole system has been completely destroyed, essentially. The railroads, too, are highly vulnerable. A lot of those trunk lines have got tunnels on them. We're about to start going after those tunnels. And by the end of the war, their railroad system was within a couple weeks of total collapse, meaning that if this war goes on through the winter of 1944, 45 to 46, it is absolutely guaranteed that there is going to be massive starvation in Japan. And Japanese sources say that it probably would have carried off between 5 and 10 million people. So that's what they're facing up to. But despite all that, the Big Six decide that we are going to keep fighting, and we're going to bet the ranch on this operation called Ketsugo, which is to make the Americans pay for the invasion of Kyushu and hopefully defeat that invasion outright, kick us back into the ocean. So the goal is to defeat that invasion and then force the Americans to the diplomatic bargaining table. And one of the things that ends up happening around this time, I think it's in March of 45, is the Diet passes a law that says every able-bodied man and woman in Japan is now a military auxiliary that is attached to whatever local Imperial Army unit is in your neighborhood, which means that the dividing line between civilian and soldier has been, if not blurred, completely erased, which is going to cause terrible problems for the Americans because the Japanese don't have sufficient quantities of uniforms, of course, to equip these people, which means that now, as an American soldier, you have no ability to discern whether or not that civilian is a soldier or a civilian trying to surrender. It means that the horror show that we saw in Okinawa is likely to be repeated or even amplified if this thing comes down to an actual invasion. So the net result of this is that if we go through with Ketsugo, there's going to be enormous civilian casualties, and that is perfectly fine as far as the Big Six is concerned. Japanese are not dummies. They can figure out, they can look at a map just as well as we can. Kyushu is the logical place to go for us for this first invasion. And there aren't that many likely landing beaches. You saw the map. The terrain there is mostly pretty hilly and mountainous. Having been to Kyushu, I can tell you it is. And so they are very quick to identify the most likely landing beaches, and they just start pumping troops in there. So, like I say, the ranch has now been bet on this decisive battle in southern Kyushu. And so what we see happening is if we had the ability to actually invade Kyushu in, say, January of 45, that would have been a cakewalk. There's only one division in the entirety of that island. But as things go along, here we are in February, now they're up to 4 divisions and stuff. They start pumping in some tank brigades as well. Here's May of 1945. Here's July of 1945. And understand that there's some lag time here between when these units actually are physically arriving in the island and when American intelligence starts getting wind of that fact, because we've got to pick up their radio chatter and then identify them, call signs and that kind of crap, and figure out that, okay, yeah, this is the 154th Infantry Division or what have you. But the bottom line is that by July of 1945, there are a lot of red flags going off in Washington and out at Nimitz's headquarters that, like, whoa, hold the phone. There's way more Japanese troops here than we had thought. And the reality is that by this time, the Japanese, instead of 350,000 personnel, have got now the better part of 900,000 personnel. They have 10,000 plus aircraft within either on Kyushu or southern Shikoku or Honshu within range of those beaches. So now all of a sudden, the military's situation has shifted to one where instead of coming in on those beaches at a superiority of 3-1, in some cases, we're going to be coming in at near parity, which is not a recipe for success when it comes to amphibious operations. So what that means is that there's going to be a come to Jesus meeting, and we will never know how this meeting would have gone down. But all the indications are that by the end of July, it's pretty clear that the Navy, in the form of King, are looking at an invasion and saying, this just doesn't make any sense at this point. And the Navy is casualty averse. They do not want to, increase our body count as Americans any more than is absolutely necessary. The Army is like, we got to get this thing over as rapidly as possible because the American home front is restive and everybody's sick of this thing. So both of those points of view, I think, are at least somewhat valid. But of course, the lucky guy who's going to be in the middle of this decision is our newly installed president, Truman, who's having to lean on all of these guys and is not necessarily getting good information from people like MacArthur in terms of what they anticipate the likely casualties to be as a result of an invasion or not. We will never know how that meeting would have gone. My money is actually on the Navy because I just think that King is a better bureaucratic operator than any of these other cats. And at the end of the day, the Navy has the ships. And if the Navy doesn't want to go, how do you get there? I mean, obviously Truman can order them to do it, but yeah, anyway. So it's one of those sort of fascinating what ifs. All right, so now I want to talk a little bit about kind of reframing the moral calculus around the dropping of this weapon, which, as I say, has always been framed in terms of Japanese versus American lives. And the first thing I wanted to show is just a map of the mortality in the Second World War. And clearly, the major centers of death in the war were located in Russia and in Eastern Europe. But if you look at Asia, you can see that Asia is not exactly a slouch either, in that the Chinese are going to lose between 15 and 22 million people in the course of this war. The Japanese, another 3, mostly in the form of combat troops. There's also some really big famines that are going on towards the middle of 1945 that are happening in places like Java and also northern Vietnam and Tonkin. And those are contributing to the body count here as well.
Hey, John,
So,
go
yeah,
back a second. Yeah,
yeah,
so major point to be made here. What's the date of this? This is the end of the war, right? This total,
yeah.
right?
This is total mortality throughout the war as a
Yep.
whole.
So,
And
folks,
so,
look
yeah,
at
go
look
ahead.
at the size of the blue dots compared to the red dots, because
Yeah,
that represents Allied death
correct.
versus Axis death.
Yes,
So,
yes,
and what you're seeing here is order of magnitude, maybe
it is. It is.
more deaths on the Allied side than on the Axis side during the war.
Yeah,
Major point that most Americans do not take, do not understand.
yeah.
This is huge. Thanks,
Sort
John.
of an interesting side note here, a tangent, but the one that blows me away that really nobody knows about. Look at the neutral dead in Persia, three to
Yeah.
four million. Okay, you can make an argument that on a per capita basis, Persia suffers more casualties in this war than any other country. I mean, we're talking even more than Belarus or Poland. The Persians lose 25% of their population during this war, and they weren't even an active belligerent in it
Mhm.
up until the very end. Russia comes in and partitions along with the British. They cut the country in half. They're using it as a conduit to move Lend-Lease aid into southern Russia. The food system collapses. The British won't help them. The Soviets won't help them. And yeah, the result is that there's just a massive famine that happens in Persia that nobody even knows about. Anyway,
Yeah, absolutely fascinating.
yeah, it's weird stuff. But your point
Mhm.
is absolutely right. And this is another point that Rich Frank makes all the time as well, that the Japanese have done a very good job of painting themselves as victims of the war. And yet, if you look strictly at what's going on in the Asia Pacific, you can see that Allied civilian casualties outnumber Japanese casualties by, yeah, damn near 10 to 1.
Mhm.
So there's a lot of funny money here in terms of what the numbers are actually by the time you get to the summer of 1945. No one will ever know what we're looking at on an amortized basis on a per month basis because among other things a lot of these numbers are kind of backloaded in that these two big famines that are happening in Tonkin and Java only kick off towards the end of 1944. And there's still massive killing that's going on in China as well. So you have to take these numbers with a grain of salt. They're squishy, but the overall picture, no matter what numbers you end up using, are pretty dire. So if we take a look Just between the Americans and the Japanese, the Americans are losing about 10,000 guys a month at this point. The Japanese are losing around 38,000 soldiers or thereabouts, maybe about 75,000 civilians a month. And this is, again, very backloaded because the civilian mortality really doesn't take off until firebombing takes off in March of 45. But if you look wider, um, every month in China, they are losing probably about 50,000 soldiers and somewhere in the neighborhood of 250,000 civilians. And again, because of these ongoing famines and whatnot, the body counts in French Indochina and also Indonesia are also north of 100,000 or more people, civilians almost entirely per month. So yeah, this is kind of a numerical breakdown then of what we're looking at. And you can see there's a lot of people dying at this point in time. And not all of it is happening in Japan. In fact, the vast majority of it is not happening in Japan. So if you use kind of higher end figures, which is what I tend to do, pick your number, but somewhere between 5 and 700,000 people are dying every single month in Asia. 4 and 5 of those are Allied, 1 in 5 is Japanese. 85% of them are civilians, and of those civilians, 3/4 are Allied civilians, mostly Chinese, along with healthy groups of Indonesian and Vietnamese as well. So that's kind of how the pie breaks down. So I would argue that it is Japanese military action that continues to be the main driver of death in Asia at this time, because until the Japanese military lays down its arms in places like China and Tonkin and so forth, you know, none of these things can get better. And I'm not arguing that, the minute that the Japanese surrender, that all of a sudden the famines go away in these locales. But at the same time, I am arguing that I know that the Japanese military was hoarding food and withholding it from the civilians there. Nothing's going to get better until the Japanese do throw in the towel. And so the bottom line is that the longer this war goes on, the worse off everybody is, both Axis and Allied. So there's really about 3 different options at this point to bring the Japanese to their knees. The first is just to continue the blockade, right? We're going to encircle the islands with our carriers, with our submarines, and we're going to continue our mining campaign, and we're going to bring this thing to a close. So that's option number one. Submarines too. Of course, even in the middle of blockade, we're going to continue the firebombing as well. It's not like, LeMay is just going to wait around, for the blockade to do its thing. So if we do go down the blockade route, Japan is going to get hammered from the sea and from the skies until they actually fold up and cave. Option number 2 is invasion. We're going to go into Kyushu and do our thing down there. But of course, same thing applies. Even in the course of an active invasion, there will still continue to be blockade activities, and firebombing and all of that stuff is going to keep right on rocking and rolling. Or we could drop the bomb. That's option number 3. There's a fourth option that is sort of bandied about sometimes, which is, why didn't the Americans use a demonstration weapon? Why didn't we drop a bomb in the middle of Tokyo Bay or something like that, just to demonstrate how powerful this weapon was? And this is actually something that was kicked around by the Americans, but there were a number of points against it. First of all, if that demonstration is anywhere on land, it practically guaranteed that the Japanese would move Allied POWs to that demonstration site. So you're going to end up killing a lot of Allied POWs in the course of doing that. The second thing you can sort of point out is that, historically speaking, the first atomic bomb in Hiroshima did not break Japanese will at all. So, the more that the Americans kind of kick this around, it's just like, it doesn't make sense. Besides, we don't have that many bombs, right? So we're going to go ahead and do the real thing. So yeah, only 2 bombs on hand, higher chance of the B-29 being intercepted. They would move POWs to that site, and again, the historical issues. So, not a useful option. If you're going to use the bomb, you're going to use it on an actual target. So, I built some numbers around this because I'm a spreadsheet junkie, and that's just kind of how I roll. So, taking those three scenarios, here's what I'm saying for my numbers. For bombard and blockade, I'm hypothesizing that this war is going to last for 8 more months until March of 46. And of course, all of the death that is going on in broader Asia is going to continue during that time frame as well. Firebombing deaths in Japan are going to continue, and starvation is going to kick in. And we're going to figure a middle and low figure of 6 million people as opposed to 10 million people are going to starve in Japan. But that eventually Japan will throw in the towel in the spring due to famine and internal unrest. So that's the premise behind the blockade scenario. Invasion scenario, I say, is going to be a little bit quicker in that it's going to be direct military action and the failure of Ketsugo that are going to compel the Japanese surrender. So we're going to get a 6-month campaign out of this. Same ongoing death in China and all these other places. But we're now going to have very heavy American and Japanese military casualties as well. And I'm modeling them after combat on both Saipan and Okinawa. So I'm saying that 80% of Japan's military in Kyushu is going to have to be killed off. That's 800K. We're going to lose about 200,000 American military dead, and we're going to end up killing 50% of the civilian population in southern Kyushu. So that's what's going to end up happening there. Or we drop the bomb. The moral criteria I would propose is that dying from starvation is no less awful than dying from radiation sickness. In fact, I think you can make an argument actually that dying from starvation is in some ways worse because it is longer and more lingering. And I would further propose that the life of a child in China is no less valuable than a life in Japan. That the bottom line is we want to come up with a scenario that saves the maximum number of lives, whoever's lives those happen to be. So the corollary to that then is that war termination options which shed more lives, particularly more civilian lives, are ipso facto more immoral. And Bill, that's where I come down. Am I broadly in line with you?
Absolutely. So this is the third episode I think we record on the bomb. One is just technical with respect
Yeah.
to the Navy development. Second one with Richard Frank. We pounded this point over and over again that
Yeah.
that vast numbers of lives are lost in the alternative scenarios. And
Right.
I know you've done the best job of anybody I know of quantifying how many more people die
Yeah.
if we don't use the bomb.
Right.
But the largest defining point is that it wasn't just Americans and Japanese that were dying.
That's
It was
correct.
a whole bunch of people that were dying.
Yeah.
And in fact, they were dying in greater numbers than either
Yes.
Americans or Japanese. And so, yeah, you ask the Vietnamese or the Chinese or the Indonesians or anybody in the world except for people who have a moral issue with the bomb, the death
Yeah.
of the mechanism of death, phenomenology of death with the bomb, or only thinking in terms of Japanese lives.
Right.
This is like a no-brainer. I don't even
Yeah.
know why we're having this conversation in 2025, John.
Yeah. Well, I mean, having been to the Peace Park Museum a number of times, I do acknowledge that atomic combat introduces some things that are uniquely horrible.
They are.
And, when you come out of that museum, you have to acknowledge the somberness of the occasion of having to use that weapon. But that said, just the raw numbers of it really, I feel, lead to a conclusion that is fairly inescapable.
2 years
So,
ago, I filmed at in
there,
Hiroshima,
yeah,
right there,
yeah,
right? And I agree with you. It's qualitatively bad,
yes,
but quantitatively, it's the least bad option, which is, I think, what you're going to talk about next.
That's exactly where I'm going with this. Yeah, absolutely. Um, so I sort of lay out my little spectrum here of war termination options, which I actually prefer to think of as the spectrum of awful. And if you grind the numbers, and again, take these with a grain of salt, but the broad brushstrokes I am very convinced are valid. This is kind of what it looks like. If we stick with the invasion scenario, or excuse me, the blockade scenario, in the course of that 8 months of combat before Japan capitulates, they're going to lose about another 300,000 soldiers and about 6.6 million civilians. The majority of those being killed by starvation and no longer by firebombing. Meanwhile, in the Allied camp, we're going to lose, around 5 million people, the majority of those being civilians, primarily, again, in China, Indonesia, and Vietnam. The Chinese will also continue losing a large number of soldiers. So the total body count in that scenario is about 11.6 million. Invasion is a little worse than that because even though the war becomes shorter in duration because of the violence of direct military action on Kyushu, you see now the Japanese body count elevate dramatically. They now lose over 1 million soldiers and over 7 million civilians because, in addition to 6 months worth of starvation victims, you now have hundreds of thousands of people being killed by the Japanese and American military in the course of, crushing resistance in Kyushu. The body count in Allied areas goes down by a little bit because it's a 2 month shorter scenario, so starvation, et cetera, kills fewer people in the Allied areas. But still, the overall body count is slightly higher because of the direct military action in Japan. But what happens if actually our numbers are optimistic? What if in the blockade scenario, it's not 6 million people that end up starving in Japan, it's 10 million that end up starving in Japan? Well, all of a sudden, then, now that body count goes up by another 4 million people to 15.6 million as a whole. Or what ends up happening in the case of our direct military option if, gee whiz, even though we managed to capture Kyushu, the Japanese still don't throw in the towel, and now we have to go up to Tokyo and do this thing again on the Kanto Plain. All of a sudden, then your casualties from military action just go through the roof. And I think it's easy to say that you could get another 20 million dead out of this scenario, with the majority of them now being killed in Japan, probably 12, 13, 14 million or something like that. Or you drop the bomb and you're done. 1 month, and we pay our monthly surtax in broader Asia. Yes, we kill 130, 140,000 people or more in the course of those two atomic weapons, but it's over. So, again, the numbers just speak for themselves. So I would say that dropping the bomb, as awful as it was the least immoral war termination scenario that we have available among this portfolio of truly awful options. And that I think is the real problem for modern audiences, is that we imagine that there was some sort of a magical silver bullet out there that would have allowed us to end this war. Just poof, nobody ends up dying. It's just over with. The Japanese decide to surrender and we're done. That didn't exist. That in reality, the spectrum of options started at bad and went downhill from there to so bad that I think I'm going to throw up in my mouth. That's how bad it is. And that's the thing that I think a modern audience really has difficulty getting their heads around, that there was no magical unicorn path here that was going to let us terminate this war easily. It was going to be hard no matter what happens. Conclusion number two, then, dropping the bomb, as awful as it was, actually saves disproportionately more Japanese lives than any other option. That a blockade or an invasion would have killed far more Japanese than just dropping the bomb did. So there you have it. That's my lovely talk.
Any way you look at it, if your
Yeah.
Japanese die, if your humans die, in
Yep.
fact, it basically is less than 1 month's worth of the number of people dying if we continue the war,
Yeah.
and it's
That's
done.
exactly right.
Yeah.
I I do think that it's important to note that Truman was not thinking along these lines, that we have the luxury of doing this with
2020
80
hindsight.
years,
Yeah.
correct, and 80 years worth of better numbers to kind of go and look at.
Right.
Truman, as commander in chief of the US military, he is very much focused on how do I get this sucker over with as rapidly as possible with as few American lives. Doesn't even
Mhm.
really care about the Japanese. And honestly, he's not being paid to. That's not his job. But as historians, I think we can go back and evaluate the end of this conflict as a whole and look at, again, broadening this lens and saying that for the good of Asia as a whole, we we got so lucky. We got
Mhm.
so lucky the way this thing went down. Um, I, there were a number of nightmare scenarios that were being discussed in American circles. What if even Hirohito ends up surrendering, but the Kwantung Army won't? What happens then? Are we in a position where we've now got to go through the Pacific and reduce every single one of their garrisons one by one? I got to go to Rabaul. After all, I've got to go to,
Mhm.
Singapore, what have you. Um,
And, and there was a mutiny, right, in Japan.
yeah,
Ooh,
yeah,
Even
you
after the
would,
bomb was dropped, right? And so
yes,
that's not an unreasonable scenario.
no, not at
not at
all.
all.
Not at all. Yeah, troops of the Imperial Guards Division come onto the Imperial Palace grounds and are looking for the Emperor and they're looking for the recording that he made to announce the surrender. So yeah, there absolutely was a coup.
I saw a
There
movie
was.
about that. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah. So yeah, it's a hot mess.
Mhm.
And we ended up kind of lucking out. As again, it seems ironic to even say it in the context of um, yeah, dropping the bomb was lucky. No, it was horrible. Don't get me wrong, but the other thing about the bomb is that it gives the Japanese a qualitatively different thing that they can point to. It's
Yes.
almost some of them called it, it was a heaven sent, almost an excuse
Yep.
that we can't fight against this thing. I mean, are you
Yeah.
kidding? You
The
know,
Americans didn't beat us. This new
The weapon
technology,
did.
right,
right?
beat us. Right.
Yep.
And they understood too that if they kept this up, that we were going to probably use atomic weapons against the landing beaches in Kyushu.
Mhm.
And you know, um, it just doesn't make any sense anymore. That
By the
from a
way,
tech, yeah,
and we would have done that. That would have been
oh,
tactical use of nuclear
oh yeah,
weapons. Yeah.
yeah.
And
And
you
our
know,
own troops would have ended up in an irradiated wasteland as a result because we didn't understand the implications of that either.
that's right. And John, one of my friends, Jim Belcher, whose dad was a survivor of the USS Indianapolis, stayed in the Navy, got stationed in Sasebo, married a Japanese girl, and that's Jim's mom. But
Yeah,
she was training. She was 15, 16
yeah,
during this time. She was training with a bamboo stick. Kill
yeah,
one American before you die.
right,
We talked about that before, but this is real, folks.
yeah,
And I know that you have presented this very same brief in Hiroshima alongside a Hiroshima survivor. Is that right?
yes, that's right.
How did
Yeah,
that
so
go
when I
down?
do this talk, Keiko is wonderful. She's extremely professional. She's got really good English and thankfully for a guy like me, she's got great time management skills too. I really like her. But yeah, she was a 7-year-old girl in Hiroshima, and she tells our guests about what it was like seeing these people shambling out of the bomb zone and coming up to my little town north of the city proper. And it's horrific. Obviously, it's
Hmm.
absolutely
Hmm.
harrowing. Um, but no, she's never been anything but um, gracious to me. I don't know if she necessarily buys my math. Um, Having been atomic bombed, I don't know that you necessarily are required to buy my math.
No, no,
It's got
no.
perspective. I get that. But yeah, it does make for an interesting night in Hiroshima when I actually have to go through and do this talk.
Mhm.
So yeah, the other thing that I would say is there are a lot of people now who look back on Japan and say, well, they were ready to surrender. And particularly you get Day of Deceit, where the argument gets made that the Japanese were ready to surrender
Yeah,
at any
it's
point in time. And one
baloney.
of the things that Rich Frank does such a good job of in Downfall is documenting the back and forth diplomatic traffic between Foreign Minister Togo and his man in Moscow, Ambassador Sato. And Tokyo is thinking of using the Soviets to be intermediaries to try to bring this war to a close. Use the good offices of Molotov and those guys, to try to bring us to the table. And when Togo ends up cabling Sato, and Sato is a very experienced hand. He had been foreign minister in a previous administration himself. And Togo's like, I want you to go to Molotov and get ready for the crown prince to come out on a special diplomatic mission. And we're reading all of this diplomatic traffic. And in fact, in some cases, we are decoding Japan's messages more quickly than they are decoding them in Tokyo and Moscow. So we got a direct line on all of this stuff. Sato comes back to Togo and he's like, okay, well, Molotov isn't going to receive me unless you've got some terms in hand that you can offer him. And Togo at that point is sort of, it has to admit that I don't know what the terms are because, of course, I can't get anybody else on the Big Six to agree with me that there needs to be a negotiated settlement to this thing. Then the Potsdam Declaration ends up happening. And Sato wires back to Togo and he says, in my opinion, the very best deal we're going to get to end this war is acceptance of the Potsdam Declaration with the provision that the emperor is retained in place.
Mhm.
Togo immediately fires back another message to Sato and says, those terms are absolutely unacceptable to the Big Six and we will never agree to them. And the Americans know this. Okay. So having decoded all of that message traffic, we're perfectly within our rights at that point to say that the Japanese are going to fight to the last bloody dribble at this point. We've given them this ultimatum in the Potsdam Declaration. The gloves are off, man. We're going to make
Yeah.
good on this at this point. You're going down. And it's ironic, of course, because Sato precisely anticipates the terms that the Japanese will accept just 3 weeks later to actually end this war.
But only after the bombs, right? So this
Bingo.
is the deal, right? And so
Yeah,
the 2020 hindsight, the people want to rewrite history will say, but they did accept it. Therefore, we could have ended the war.
right.
Nonsense, right?
Yeah,
We didn't know that they would accept it. All we knew is that Togo said they would not accept it. We
Yeah,
knew
I was
that
going to say
yeah,
quite the opposite.
unequivocally. Yeah,
right.
exactly.
That's exactly
Unequivocally,
right.
right?
Yeah,
It was only the bomb that changed their mind.
And
that's
I
what I
think
think.
I was going to say, you're talking about Operation Olympic, and you look at that map of Kyushu, and there's, in the center of the island, there's a lot of mountains there.
Yeah, there are.
There's a lot of ridges. There's a lot of valleys. There's a lot of, terrain features, shall we say.
Yeah.
Very reminiscent of places like Peleliu and
Mm.
Okinawa, and to a
Yeah.
lesser degree, Saipan. And I think, honestly, I forget what the figures, the estimated figures were for Kyushu. I think they're significantly higher. And I think at some point, we go back to what we talked about at the very beginning of this episode is the American home front. And if we're sending, John, and you and I talked about this when we did Kure, when Bill had his technical issues, we're looking at having a draft,
Yeah.
anywhere between 150,000 to 200,000 men, boys now,
Yeah.
by the way, in 1945 and 1946 to get this operation going and
Yeah.
to sustain it. I think at some point the American populace is going to go enough.
Yeah.
enough.
Right.
And we knew that. We being the United States, the leadership knew this. They knew, I mean, we were talking again, we were just talking about this, the whole issues going on in New York. New York wasn't the only damn place that were
Yeah.
having issues in the home front. It was all over the country. People were sick of it. We were
Yeah.
sick and tired of everything. They were sick and tired of people dying. As obnoxious as it is, they were sick and tired of not having gas, not being able to get a ham, all this other kind
Yeah.
of things. And then people were tired of it. The
Yeah.
country was running out of money. The population also, by the way, was not exactly affluent at that time either. We
Yeah.
were reaching a breaking point. It wasn't immediate, but
Yeah.
it
I mean,
was
I
going
don't,
to come
it,
soon.
right. I would shy away from trying to portray American morale as somehow cracking.
Mm-mm.
But it's clear
That's not what I'm
from,
saying.
yeah, but
I'm just saying that
people are,
they're sick of it.
they're sick of it. They're grumpy.
Yeah, no, there is no morale issue. It's a matter of patience. I think it's a patience issue.
That's exactly right. There was a quote in the New York Times the day after the bomb gets dropped, and actually I'm gonna find this thing right here because it's
That
such a wonderful quote.
But the
Um,
thing is too that while you're looking for that, Truman knows all this. He's keenly aware that the American population is sick and tired of this war. He's keenly aware
Mhm.
too that a lot of the units that are being brought over from Europe to go to the Pacific, that's the last thing on earth they want to do. So that is a bit of a morale issue, or could be in the United
yeah,
States military at that point, guys coming from Europe over to the Pacific. So it's reaching a point where something has to be done, and it's got to be done like right now.
right. So this quote, they're talking about the reaction to the dropping of the bomb, and they're talking about some of the American governmental officials. Their opinion can be summed up in the comment by one spokesman: "Why bother with psychological warfare against an enemy that already is beaten and hasn't sense enough to quit and save herself from utter doom?
Mhm.
We're sick of it. We're
Mhm.
sick of messing around with you." So
Yeah,
to take us back to the opening slide with the Black Knight,
A
yeah,
sane belligerent would have given up already.
that's
They haven't
correct.
given up already.
Now
Ergo,
I'm
they
just
are
gonna
not sane.
I'm just gonna kill you is what it comes
Right.
down to. I'm
Yeah.
tired of this.
Yeah.
Tired of this nonsense.
Right.
So yeah, again, thank your lucky stars, even though it was absolutely horrible. And I will say that you've been to the Peace Museum as well. I have I have some interpretational problems with that at this point.
Me
In
too.
that, with the recent remodeling of the museum, the exhibits that are devoted to what actually physically happens to the Japanese population are much more extensive.
Hmm.
So in a nutshell, you got to go all the way across this upper bridge exhibit
I
and all
remember it. Yeah. To find any context. Yeah.
right.
It would be
45
like
minutes.
going to the Holocaust Museum
Right.
and and then providing justification for the
Right.
Holocaust in the Holocaust Museum, right?
And there did need to be context around there, and I think some of their context is actually fairly well done, but by the time you get done with 45
To it.
minutes of charred babies, you
You don't
know,
want to see it anymore.
yeah, you're just like, I'm
Yeah.
done. I'm going down to the lobby and I'm going to wait for the rest of the group to show up and then we'll leave.
Right. Yeah, Nagasaki is just as bad.
And that's what I've heard. I haven't
Yeah,
been to that one.
it is. It's got this incredible statue out front. It almost looks like anime. It just the people who are killed deserve memorialization. Let me say
Right.
that. I'm not saying that they don't, but
Totally.
this ludicrous statue that's out in front has a guy pointing to the sky, a really bizarre looking dude pointing to the sky where the bomb came from. And I would say that if you're going to memorialize the people who died, civilians, innocent civilians who died, just like innocent civilians died in far greater numbers in China
Yep.
and Indonesia and the Philippines, um, you ought to give them a better tribute than you've given them, folks.
Right. Yeah. There was a passage from one of John Toland's books at the very end of a young woman who survived Nagasaki. She
Hmm.
was in a hospital, and she runs out of the hospital after the bomb and she's running up into the hills. And as she's running up this path, she goes past one of a cache of these bamboo spears that they have been drilling with, to repel the invasion. And she can still see the B-29, overhead, and she just loses it. But she's like, Baka, Baka Yaro, this is stupid. How could you guys have expected us to somehow fight against an
That
enemy that has that and that? It's
with
just
bamboo sticks.
with
with
this. Yeah.
bamboo
Yeah,
sticks. Are
exactly.
you
It,
kidding me?
Yeah.
I think a large reason, and I don't think I'm wrong here, that some of the attitude, some of the way things are displayed in Japan, in terms of war guilt,
Mhm.
or victimization of the Japanese people, is due in large part to the fact that, to put it in a very sloppy term, we didn't rub their nose in it
This is
at the end of
exactly
the
right.
war.
And this is
Because
MacArthur's fault.
It
it is,
is.
because if you look
It
at
is.
Germany, if you look at Germany, which I've been to a gazillion times, I've been to a lot of their museums, it is completely opposite,
Right.
completely opposite of what
Got it.
anything would be in Japan.
Yeah.
And
Mhm.
because we rubbed their noses in it, we rubbed their
Yep.
Yeah.
noses in it from the get-go.
Yep.
And we wanted to make sure that, look, we wanted to make sure that they understood you people screwed up big time.
Yeah.
And we're going to make sure that you never forget that you screwed up big time, because we don't want to come over here and
Ever
deal with you
again.
people a third time, because we're
Right.
tired of this crap.
Right.
And that didn't happen in Japan. And if you
Yep.
go to Germany today and you talk to a German person of, say, 40 years old, 50 years old, they abhor the Third Reich.
Yep.
They take total blame, even though they may not have had any relative even fight in the Wehrmacht. They take
Mhm.
total blame for everything that happened. In Japan, that does not occur.
Yeah.
It doesn't. And you can explore the racism aspect of that both ways, because you could say on one hand, well, no, let's be clear. There are absolutely racist, things about the way both sides fought in that war. No
Sure.
doubt. No doubt.
You got to
On the other
demonize your
hand,
enemy.
yeah, you could say that we didn't rub their nose in it, ergo, we didn't see it as a racist war. Or you could say we didn't rub their nose in it because we don't expect them to behave in a civilized manner. So, I mean,
I
there's all kinds of, you could
no, I think
triangulate this. Go ahead, John.
what ended up happening there is the Cold War starts so
Mhm.
quickly,
Mm-mm.
and MacArthur is determined to have a staunch anti-communist bastion in,
Yep.
the Western
Japan.
Pacific, and that's got to be Japan.
Mhm.
And I've already made the decision that I'm, going to rehabilitate Hirohito to an extent, because I'm looking at him as the guy that's going to guide me through this transitionary period. And I don't want any domestic unrest at this point in time. I got
Mhm.
enough of the problems. The problem for me becomes, okay, yeah, I can see having the emperor be that figurehead for the first year or so. But by the time you get into the spring and summer of 1946, and now America has been responsible for the feeding of Japan. We bring in like 800,000 tons of food or something like that. And Rich Frank, again, has done a lot of work in this space. It's really exemplary. Um, I think it's absolutely clear by that point to the Japanese who's in charge here. Okay.
Mhm.
And if it had been me, I would have said, gee, Hirohito, look at the time. We have a perfectly serviceable crown prince that I can put on the throne to keep the imperial house going. I don't need you anymore. It's time for you to
Mhm.
go on trial, my dude, and I'm going to hang him.
Mhm.
Um, and then because there did need to be some symbolic nose rubbing at the very highest levels.
Mhm.
And yeah, we allowed the Japanese, who are a very consensus oriented society, to basically shovel a lot of stuff under the rug. And as given the opportunity to do that, they were not going to unshovel that.
Mm-mm.
Mhm.
The other big driver there, of course, is the actions of the Imperial Army throughout the region, and wherever they fought, they were horrible, right? Which means that, in essence, any Japanese soldier who fought in China and comes back home, that dude's a war criminal. He probably is, he probably bayoneted babies or something like that, but in a consensus oriented society, how do you even talk about that rationally? That, I'm living now with, 5 million guys, Uncle Kenji used to bayonet Chinese babies, it's just,
Yeah, now he's back to making shoes.
yeah, he's doing whatever here. So, yeah, a lot of stuff just got glossed over and kind of, I just don't want to talk about that anymore. And we're left with the legacy of it.
I think a lot of that too it falls back on the war crimes trials or lack thereof. Not saying that there weren't war crimes trials in Japan, because there certainly were, but not to the degree of Nuremberg.
No.
We didn't take Yonai and Suzuki and Hirohito, and I agree with you. I don't think 1945 was the right time to do it, but we didn't take those guys and put them up in the dock and just say, let me recount all the terrible crap that you people did over the last 10 years.
Right.
And we're going to hang you because of this, because we are theoretically a civilized society. Oh, and by the way, to your point, we're feeding you people and we're pumping you full of capitalism and democracy. So, yay, United States. These are the guys that got you to the point where you were before we came to help you. You're gone.
Yeah.
And I think if that happens, which obviously it does not, I think if that happens, I think you see a significantly different opinion of the war in Japan today. I really do.
Yeah.
Including the bombs.
Even short of crimes to justify capital punishment. I mean, there are a whole bunch of other crimes
Prison time for crying
that
out
Japan
loud.
never, how long did it take them to acknowledge the existence of comfort women? The 1980s, right?
Yeah.
Slaves, sex slaves on a massive scale. We're talking tens of thousands, perhaps 100,000 sex slaves, and it took until the 1980s to even acknowledge that. We missed so many opportunities. We need to learn from this.
Yeah. The flip side of the coin too is that, of course, the Koreans and the Chinese are still, in particular, are also incredibly pissed off about this to this day. And they will sometimes cynically use that, in a nationalistic sense to stoke up, anti-Japanese fervor, so a lot of the different Asian parties, don't necessarily play completely straight 2020 hindsight kind of ball. And it's hurting our ability at this point to string together a good coalition in the Pacific to offset the Chinese, because the Koreans are incredibly important in any sort of an arrangement like that. And if they can't get along with the Japanese, you got a problem, I will never forget, Margaret and I had been there. This is 1991. We had to switch our visa out. And so the way you do that is you exit Japan and you switch from a tourist visa to whatever other kind of visa. So we took the ferry from Shimonoseki across the Tsushima Straits and ended up in Busan. And we get off in the ferry in the morning. We go through customs and the Korean custom guard. Oh, you're Americans. Hey, welcome to the country. Boom, boom. Behind us, all the Japanese tourists who were coming off of that ship, the custom guards were like, give me your suitcase. We're looking for contraband. No, they weren't. They just hated the Japanese. Yeah, totally. Just like, oh yeah, okay, you're good. Why don't you clean your shite up and get on out of here? So, those sorts of memories, it goes on and on and on.
Yeah, I got to say that the effects from failure to deal with this in 1945 cascade to this day.
Yes,
there was a long period of time when the Chinese were perfectly happy with us, the United States, having all these bases in Japan, because it would promise to neutralize Japan.
Right.
And the Chinese saw Japan as more of a threat than the United States being in Japan as a threat. Now that pendulum may be swinging, yeah. But it has implicated. But why are we there? Now we're there for China, not Japan, right? But these things have 80 years of legacy.
Memory.
Long legs.
Yeah. Anyway, well, There we
you
go. There we go. Any
Yeah.
I'll be very, very interested to see the comments on this episode.
Yeah, me
Yeah.
too.
And
By
I'll
the
be
way,
very
folks,
interested.
if you're interested in that Richard Frank analysis that John referred to, it's episode 225. It's our second season where we talked about downfall with Richard, and it comes at the same issue from a different angle, and but it's just as compelling.
Yeah. Yeah, he's the
Mm.
real scholar in that space. I'm just kind of riffing off his
No,
stuff.
but I love the analysis that you've done, John, and it's really important. You know, these
Richie.
two episodes, Rich's and this one, I would proclaim, believe it or not, this is a submariner saying this, are the two important episodes we've probably done in this show because of the ethical analysis and implications that we're exploring here.
Yeah. No, I think that's true. I mean, the bombs really do have a huge ripple effect that come right down to the present day. And there's a lot of, ill-considered, not very analytic thinking about the usage of this particular weapon. So,
All right, gang.
Yeah, thank you.
Yes, no, that was fascinating. That was important too, because, as we're drawn to the end of the war, this is the bombs are the elephant in the room.
Mm-hmm.
And they are. I mean, they are, because you got to explain it to a degree. I see a lot of comments on our channel that people, Americans still to this day have no earthly clue what the hell they're talking about. None.
Yeah.
And hopefully this, rectifies some of that thinking.
A little extra grist for the mill.
Yeah, maybe so.
Yeah.
Maybe so.
When you consider the invasion scenario or the blockade scenario, we're going back to Lamentations chapter 4, verse 9. Those killed by the sword are better off than those who die of famine. They will rack away with hunger and waste away. And it was true 2,500 years ago. It's still true today.
Right.
Yeah.
Yikes.
All right, gentlemen.
Uplifting note.
Yeah.
Thanks for having me. Always a good time.
Absolutely. Yeah. Always. Well, with that, we want to say thank you very much for listening and or watching to this episode of the Unauthorized History of the Pacific War podcast. Give us a rating and review. If you are not watching this episode, I highly suggest that you do, so you can see the slides that John was presenting. If you have a question or a comment, send us an email at unauthorizedpacificpodcast@gmail.com. Once again, my name is Seth Perrodin. I want to thank you very much for listening and or watching. John, as always, it's always a pleasure. Always a pleasure.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Bill.
You too, Bill.
Bring us home.
See you again next week.